safety stock is, of course, a big part of just-in-time, and putting that in there has been there from the beginning of, this is some Toyota guys who wrote the first paper on just-in-time in the 70s. And for Toyota at the time, 10%, that was based on their capability. That's what they were able to achieve. But they still had, of course, some safety inventory in there. And so you set that level of inventory clearly based on these three key criteria. First, product characteristics, right? We hear a lot about PPE, right? Personal protective equipment. And you want to have a lot of that for when the crisis hits. And so you're going to have a big inventory for that. Is it a normal good? Is it a critical good? So those product characteristics. Also environmental conditions. How severe is that risk of disruption? And for you, is it severe or not? For what's severe for one company with lower capability may not be severe for a company with a higher capability. So is it severe? How much risk is that for the severe disruption? And then, of course, the last one, what's your capability? And so that's the key. That's how you can achieve this, overcoming the trade-off between this competitiveness versus continuity, is by building up these what we call supply chain continuity capabilities, SCCC, to get a mutually reinforcing relationship rather than that trade-off. And prior to the pandemic, we looked at the typical disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis, fires, floods, and that's what the companies showed us. So we did case studies of the companies that were able to achieve this dual, the both and instead of the either or. But with John Paul, Taka Fujimoto and I also looked at it after the pandemic. This is an example from the typical or the pre-pandemic, what we thought of as disasters, that Toyota achieves this. So supporting a supplier, this is 1995 when there was an earthquake. And this is, it wasn't a team of this elite SWAT team kind of group that goes in that's really always ready for disasters and they're always preparing for the disaster. No, they're just doing their regular daily operational excellence, Kaizen and continuous improvement on the daily basis. And that's what's preparing them for the crisis. It's not some special team that only does crisis management. That's not their day job. Their day job is just working in the factory, the regular workers. So we can see here that it's that mutually reinforcing relationship. And the front line problem solving is that common thread. So typically in continuous improvement, you're going to solve a problem, every day or every period. So we could say they're horizontally arranged, but in the disaster, they all happen at once. And you don't need to find the problems, right? They're obvious. But it's fundamentally the same activity. It's dividing in the problems and getting the right people to solve those problems simultaneously rather than sequentially. But it's essentially the same problem solving. And so those skills that are good in the daily activity are also useful in that disaster recovery. We can draw it this way too. So PDCA, problem solving day at a time versus all in one day. But we wanted to look at the pandemic because it's clearly a very different disaster. The first global and invisible disaster that's hit the world in the modern era when we have this globalized competition. So what changes? And basically the story is the same. So you still need this investing in capabilities for continuity to push out that performance frontier so that you can achieve both. But here we see the typical way that performance frontier is drawn, right? This curve outwards. So you can choose, hopefully you're at the end of it and you can choose any of these spots, but it's not always like that. If you have weak capabilities, you're actually going to look a little different. And here we have, so the details are in the paper, but I'll just describe the upper left there. So if we look at competitiveness, clearly, if you have shorter lead times, you're going to be more competitive, right? You can deliver quickly. And the continuity curve there shows how quickly you can recover. So that's measuring the continuity capability. And if it's weak, which is this first one, you're actually going to end up either at those extremes because you don't get the performance frontier, curved outwards. You have it curved inwards. So you would never want to go to one of those inwards. So you're just going to go to the extreme. And that explains why we see this pendulum swinging between so-called just-in-time and just-in-case. But as you raise that capability and you move the recovery time to the left here, you see that the frontier moving out. And if you can bring it to very strong capabilities so that your recovery times are quickly, you can actually get to that where you can get both. And so what are those capabilities? What are the supply chain continuity capabilities that we're talking about? Well, the first one has to be protective, right? So stopping the damage from happening in the first place, or if it's a pandemic, from the virus getting inside the factory or other nodes on the supply chain. Second would be after the disaster happens, the damage happens, how quickly can you recover the place that was damaged? But sometimes that's not. You can't do it fast enough. Maybe you need to go to substitute production. So how quickly can you ramp up the substitutive production? And then switching between these is important to be able to be fast and agile to switch. We put them on this chart here so we can see that there's a planning side to it, and what you do before that mitigation before the disaster happened definitely affects how you're going to recover and deal with the disaster after it happens. For protective, the little distinction here on the chart is that for protective, it's not after, but during. So that like in a flood, keeping the water from coming in, or in a pandemic, keeping the virus from coming into the factory. So those three capabilities to make this supply chain continuity capability. And we have these case studies in the paper also showing how, for most of all, how Toyota can do those three and move between them, but also specific case studies for each of those. On our mind still, COVID-19. So here's a Panasonic example for what they did at this factory, making semiconductor equipment. So when the pandemic started to really happen in Japan in March and April, they introduced about 10 anti-COVID measures. But that was not where they started from. They had already 10 or so measures in the plant already. So they were able to strengthen those and bring in new ones, because I guess you could say they had a running start. So that preparation was able to allow them to get COVID-free and stay COVID-free. But the key part is also the psychological side. And getting because especially with a pandemic, it really matters that every single person is involved and engaged. And so the greeting at the plant was, how you doing against COVID? That was how people said hello to each other, to get because it's really about every single person. And it's like that in the other disaster cases as well, but we don't maybe notice it as much as in the pandemic. And there's a word in Japanese, kizuna, which is this bond that people form when we go through hard times together. And so that just-in-time continuous improvement, handling small crises together, is building this bond, which then helps the people get through the big crisis. So the stronger at just-in-time, the better they'll be also at disaster recovery. And maybe this trade-off and overcoming of it actually might sound familiar, especially to Gerpisa and PVMI, because having the frontline workers be the ones that are able to push the company to overcome the trade-off, which we saw in this competitive continuity trade-off, is quite similar to the quality and the cost trade-off that the Japanese OEMs and suppliers showed was possible in the research showed that they had done it by the frontline workers being not just the workers, but also building in the quality. So it's not relying on inspectors at the end of the line to catch quality defects, but each worker catching the quality defect and pulling the andon cord, stopping the line. So having the workers be problem finding and problem solving is the way they could overcome the quality cost trade-off. It's a similar story for competitiveness and continuity. But the key in the quality cost one is that when you have these productivity improvements through continuous improvement, so you could do a work with 5 people and then you improve it down to 4, you Kaizen it down to 4, and you fire the 5th person. No worker is going to be a fool and do Kaizen ever again, right? So if you're fired, then why am I going to work for Kaizen to fire my colleague, my coworker. So there has to be trust that that fifth person is actually not going to get fired. You take the best person out of the team of 5 and you put them on another harder task. And so it's a reward for the person to get taken off, not to be fired, but to put on a more challenging job. And since Gerpisa is originated in France, I just wanted to bring up the yellow vest. I think we all remember a little before the pandemic. So, people standing up and saying, remember the frontline workers. And I think the pandemic has actually reminded us all about those frontline workers. And it's not just enough to clap, right? It's we really value you, but it's, well, here it says, top us up and make sure you pay us too. But also I think job security is the key thing that we can't forget. Because when we talk about links in the supply chain, we're really talking about people. So, if you break it down, in the end, you're going to get to people. And that's the real links. And I think that the pandemic story of the Panasonic factory, where you have to have each person engaged to keep that virus out. So it's really all, to get a strong supply chain, it's all the people, both the direct and indirect, have to individually and work together to get a strong supply chain. So wrapping up, so this and competitiveness and continuity can be achieved through this bottom-up process where continuous improvement, so for today, for competitiveness, is also what brings the tomorrow and the continuity, and through involving everyone. And the key is the executives. A Toyota guy, I once asked a plant manager, so how important is the plant manager? Because it's worker-led. And you know what his answer was? 99% of it's determined by the top. And I said, I thought it was worker-led. He says, well, at the top, if you decide it's worker-led, it can be worker-led. But if the top decides it's not going to be worker-led, it's not going to be worker-led. So in the end, it's leadership. So those executives and managers have to be committed to including everyone. It's not just about the workers. But of course, all the workers need to be treated well. So so continuous improvement just in time for short term, but also for when the disaster hits, the big one. And so my final slide, maybe disaster mitigation is not the ugly duckling anymore, but maybe this really is the swan, that we see the beauty when we do see those frontline workers and those first responders. They saved our lives, and maybe we can appreciate them now more. But the key is, can we do that in the normal times as well, so that we invest in those supply chain continuity capabilities in the normal times too. I think that's where the supply chain needs to evolve, and I hope we're on our way. Thank you.
So next up is Mike Jackson from OESA, and then he'll be followed, which is the US-based Supplier Association. And Flavio Volpe will follow him from the Canadian counterpart.
Okay, no worries. Great. Well, listen, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be listening. Really a pleasure to be here to provide a bit of an outlook and an update. My name is Mike Jackson. I have the pleasure of leading strategy and research at OESA, the Original Equipment Supplier Association. OESA is part of MEMA, which is the Motor and Equipment Manufacturers Association. And we have the privilege of representing over 907,000 employees within the manufacturing sector. And so what's an amazing thing, we have about 500 member companies that we represent, and we'll see some of the research that we do on an ongoing basis. We do a wide range of surveys of our members, and because there's this nearly 25 years of trust, there's great transparency and great insight on some of the questions that we ask. And so clearly an incredibly volatile time. Daniel, brilliant assessment there. And I'll just kind of go through quickly a number of different elements with regard to the economy. But with that, we'll jump right in, okay? Mm-hmm. Sure. Great. Well, what I want to do is simply talk about the idea that, supply chains, obviously, we know the industry is global, right? Supply chains are global. We'll come back to the US market a little bit. We'll talk about some sales and production dynamics, and then we'll talk a little bit about the supplier response and some of the assessment of the information, the insight that we received from our members, and then we'll talk about some takeaways. Okay, so with that, what I want to simply highlight is the fact that we started off this year, as we typically do over the past couple of years. We've started off relatively optimistic, and yet then in 2020, obviously the pandemic hit In 2021, it was the pandemic, but it was the cascading from the pandemic into supply chain, all kinds of supply chain challenges with regard to semiconductor and then a whole host of others. And what I want to simply highlight is the fact that if we look at global GDP, it's pretty remarkable to think that we were supposed to be at 4.2% GDP here at the start of this year, and yet it's been downgraded dramatically. And so we're down to 3%, and I think there's even some downside pressure there already. And so what I want to simply highlight is the fact that, you look here, here in North America, closer to home, US, 2.4 is the latest assessment here for this year, 2% next year. Mexico, 1.9, the year after, 2.1. And if you look down below, what you see is simply in red, that's simply noting what it was like the downgrade, the dramatic downgrade since the start of the year. Now, obviously, we had a whole host of different issues, right? We had, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and supply chain, continued supply chain disruption, but now we have inflation, running rampant. And so there are a number of different factors. And so I just simply want to highlight this because it has big implications then for all kinds of input costs, a number of different factors with regard to suppliers and the industry as a whole, let alone business. A quick one here, if we look at, price per gallon, if we look at what's pretty remarkable, US is at an all-time high at over $5, and yet Germany at just under $7.90 a gallon. Norway and Denmark, up well over $10 a gallon. Okay, so what does this mean? It obviously creates huge disparity, tremendous challenges for suppliers from the standpoint that, obviously, this is gas, but gas, petrochem, we're talking about resin inputs, a whole host of input costs are dramatically higher. Logistics, significantly higher, right? All kinds of different implications. And then as a result, consumers is the big ticket purchase for an automobile. And so there are all kinds of headwinds with regard to consumer sentiment, consumer confidence, and the rest. So we'll keep going. This obviously, I want to just simply highlight the fact that the Russian invasion, Ukraine, obviously a huge human toll, but then also obviously even more disparity in terms of volatility relative to supply chain for a whole host of different reasons. Obviously oil and natural gas, but palladium, neon gas, and a range of other metals. We know that, low cost manufacturing of wire harnesses or, low labor prices are a requirement for wire harness manufacture in Ukraine. And so as a result of the conflict there, had a huge impact in terms of disrupting production in Western Europe. What I want to highlight, though, is that what's happened since then is that the situation continues to, if you look to the chart to the right, effectively, there are a number of energy companies, a number of businesses that have simply walked away from Russia, walked away from the market there. They've ceased operations. And I understand that is, a decision, that they don't take lightly. But at the same time, if you look at their BP, $24 billion impact in terms of an asset by writing off its investment there in Rosneft. Shell, Exxon, a number of other organizations as well. My question here is simply what are the implications in terms of, Renault, when it comes back to the automotive space? Renault recently just sold its operations for 1 ruble, right? There were nearly $15 billion of investment in Russia, to modernize the automotive sector there. And so my question simply is, well, who stands to benefit? I mean, by walking away, there's a tremendous cost associated with that. And so it's something that's in the back of my mind. If we look here then in terms of volume on a global basis, we were expected to actually grow global demand by a pretty meaningful amount, by over 4%. Now we're looking at effectively a flat market. And once again, this continues to come under pressure. So what's not a big surprise if we look at Europe, clearly demand in Russia, Ukraine is collapsed. And if we look as well over to China, obviously significant lockdowns, some very, very real, shocks to the economy there. And as a result, a flat outlook here for the China market. So a pretty significant shift. And so my point simply here is that if we look at suppliers, we look at automakers, all of a sudden you're talking about, additional costs or more costs with lower volume. And so this represents a tremendous headwind for the industry as a whole. So quickly here, if we look on a global production basis, this has already been revised downward rather significantly, but we're talking about a nearly 4% rise from production from year ago levels. Okay, so this is the May 22 forecast from IHS Markit. You know, what we're looking at here, 80.35 million units globally. It's meaningful. It's over 4% increase from year ago, but this year was supposed to be the recovery year. We're supposed to be the year when we finally have a sufficient supply of semiconductor and actually have a strong opportunity to continue to grow. And that's obviously been curtailed to a degree. We look next year, and certainly significantly higher volumes are expected in terms of are reflected in this forecast. Other analysts and consulting firms are certainly far more bearish, anticipating that supply chain constraints are going to last well into next year. If we look here quickly at global electrification, it's pretty remarkable. But even during the pandemic, we actually saw dramatic increases in electrification in sales. And so this includes both plug-in as well as pure BEV. And the point here is simply that in 2020, it was up over 43%. In 2021, over 108%. What's pretty remarkable here is that there are a much wider range of products available, right? If we think of historically, your EV was, they were not exactly science fair projects, but they were certainly not expected to scale. And now what we're looking at is this next iteration. We're looking at the next iteration of product, which is far more capable, and in many cases is far more useful. Instead of small cars, compact cars, we're talking about compact or mid-size utilities. And so sport utility typically has greater functionality, greater pricing power. So it simply offers up a significant opportunity. We look quickly here on a global basis. It's interesting, but clearly North America well behind the rest of the world. We look at China really dominating, and Europe behind, but certainly in a very, very dominant position. In terms of number two here. What I think is pretty striking, though, is the market in Europe was flat and EVs rose by 66%. In China, it was up by just under 5%, and electric vehicles sales rose by over 155%. Now, that said, China certainly many incentives, many subsidies, and so there are a whole host of drivers. In many cases, in many situations, it's cost prohibitive to even, or it's not even available to purchase a vehicle. An ICE offering. So pretty challenging that way. Interesting, but the key point here is that in North America, we're growing dramatically, and yet we're still well behind. Thank you so much. Quickly, if we look back at the U.S. market, I simply want to highlight, obviously, the S&P 500 down dramatically. We're down 20%. We're in a bearish market now. Consumer sentiment at a historic low. So this has huge implications, right? So all of a sudden, we're under a lot of pressure, and consumers, these are two key drivers in terms of vehicle purchases. Now, we know that obviously supply is constrained, and so right now demand remains very robust, and so any vehicle that's being produced is being sold. And yet, clearly there's the propensity for demand destruction under such a period of volatility. Probability of recession up 30%, at 30% now, based on the survey, the most recent survey here from Bloomberg. Interestingly enough, Bank of America issued a note here over the weekend, saying that we're in a technical recession effectively right now, but the U.S. and we just don't realize it. Clearly we know the Fed is expected to raise rates here in a pretty dramatic fashion, and so a tough balancing act here to in the economy in terms of pricing. Price gains, but at the same time avoiding a recession. Quickly here, if we look at labor force, looking here, the red line represents effectively trend of employment, and yet what we see here to the right is this the gray bar represents the millions of jobs, millions of the gap in the labor force that we don't that contributes to right now a significantly higher pricing in terms of labor market wages. We see far more volatility here. And so as a result, this is another headwind for suppliers and for the industry as a whole. A lot of competition from across industry. Look at the federal funds rate. Clearly we know that rates are going to rise and rise rather dramatically. I think more importantly, though, we'll talk about it a little bit here, just in terms of what that means relative to access to capital, particularly for a lot of these emerging players. And so if we look here, this is one of the key pieces. If we look at input prices across manufacturing, this doesn't even include all of it, right? This includes a good amount, but historically we're at a compound annual growth rate of 2.6%, from 2017 to 2020 in that time frame, and now we're looking at nearly 10% compound annual growth rate, and that's just for a range of inputs here. It doesn't even include capital, labor, and imports. So we know that prices are meaningfully higher, and that represents a significant headwind. So a quick one here, if we look at industry stock as of last year, inventory, it's a pretty remarkable 2018. Basically here had inventory of nearly 4 million units. As of the end of last year, it was 1.2, so down 2.8 million units of inventory. What does that mean? It's supply and demand. If you don't have supply, pricing certainly is, so as a result, incentives, collapsed. And so that's a good thing. And that contributes then to this historic high in terms of average transaction price, all the way to the right. And historic high here in terms of average transaction price, over $45,000, huge gap there. The issue is this, right? Is OEMs have the ability to sell product, and the products they're selling, the prices fluctuate based on supply and demand. Well, the issue though is that suppliers have fixed prices. They have fixed contracts for selling their components, and so as a result, they have to go back and renegotiate each time. And so, hey, well, we're seeing more cost in these areas. And so the longer, the process takes in order to make the supplier whole, the greater the risk is in terms of not only a supplier in terms of the tier one, but then it cascades down across the supply chain. And so it represents an element of risk, because it certainly is smaller tier twos, tier threes and beyond don't necessarily have the financial means to weather this type of storm. And so this is a challenge. Quick one here in terms of vehicle buying conditions, certainly the reason why it's declined so dramatically, prices are high. And so that it represents a headwind. Certainly, this is a really important one here. If we look at the green line is the sales forecast here, the forecast here at the start of the year. The blue line represents production, and the gray line there represents break even across the respondents for this survey. And so effectively the last 2 years, right, production was below break even. So that means that suppliers weren't profitable these past 2 years. And so right now we're once again in another challenging environment where we do have a reasonable amount of gap. Okay, so that break even level is at 13.75 million units. Well, production was supposed to be in the low 15 million unit range. Now we're down to about 14.75. And so we're now that gap is 1 million units. It was closer to 1.5 million. And so the issue here is that, there are more headwinds, and there are certainly some risks that continue to impact the supplier community. Quick one here. If this is obviously been updated here a number of times, but this is just simply to capture that in North America, production has been revised lower by nearly 500,000 units a year, from the start of this year. So this is the March to February. It's maintained, a bit of consistency here, but just to kind of visualize the kind of volume impact. And so when you're planning and budgeting at the end of last year, looking at the volume forecast for this year, all of a sudden that's come under, it's taken a haircut. And so that represents, again, further downside pressure. A quick one here, if we look at a wide range of different policies that are supporting investment in electrification, the administration rejoining the Paris Agreement, all kinds of investment in terms of EV package, battery research. California, resumes additional authority in terms of, CAFE. GM making an announcement, limiting pollution from all light duty vehicles by 2035. I mean, there's a whole host of them here. And so this is clearly, these are all factors that support a movement here within electrification. What's pretty challenging, though, is that we know that, there's this great divide in terms of pricing. We just talked about, historic highs in the U.S. market at $45,000 per unit. And yet we look here, and this is effectively the average here based at the start of this year, and we're well over $62,000, nearly $63,000 per unit. And so this represents, clearly it's a a premium offering for a far more affluent buyer. And so it really does represent a continued hurdle here in terms of seeing the kind of growth across the market in terms of adoption rates. Quick one, if we look then here at supplier barometer, second quarter. So this is a survey of our members. How is your 12-month outlook and how has it changed over the past 3 months? Well, effectively, it's gone down pretty meaningfully by 12 points from the first quarter. Okay, so it's at a 40, the supplier barometer index at 40 is 10 points to the negative. And this simply means that, hey, over the past 3 months, I've become more pessimistic. And so, clearly that reflects in large part the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also then, significant lockdowns, widespread lockdowns across China and other, headwinds, certainly inflation and the like. So what are the biggest industry threats? The number one threat, production shutdowns due to supply chain shortages. Okay, this is the biggest issue because what happens is oftentimes suppliers receive orders, and then from those orders, they fight tooth and nail for every employee to keep them. They're paying higher wages, they're paying overtime, they're paying shipping premiums, and then paying increases on raw materials, and then only to have orders canceled. And because there's not clarity, there's not the visibility to see, do we have adequate supplies of semiconductors? And so this is a big factor. Labor availability, another issue, lots of competition from other sectors. So if we look here at component raw material shortages, if we look here, indicate the level of severity the following input shortages and logistics challenges have had in your business and the likelihood they'll be resolved within the next 6 months. And we look to the top right, and you see that there's high impact and long effect, and that semiconductor still is not expected to be resolved within that 6-month window. Same is true for port and border delays, more logistics issues, a number of headwinds there as well. I think it's pretty interesting that steel and aluminum is also not quite in that same category, but there is some severity, there is some pain there. So something to be mindful of as well. Quick one here, if we look at by 2029, 119 unique nameplates, domestically built battery electric nameplates. Okay, there were only 7 in 2019, and that's for competing for just over 5 million units of volume. And so the challenge here, though, is that only amounts to 42,000 vehicles per nameplate. And so the issue here is that if you take out a Model 3, a Model Y, and you take out hundreds of thousands of units of volume, it's actually much lower than 42,000. 42,000 for a supplier, for an automaker, represents effectively not quite a halo vehicle, but you're talking about niche, right? You're not talking about something where you have critical mass, where you have sufficient scale to be cost effective. And so it represents a significant challenge. Quick one here, look at risk mitigation. Elon Musk was asked here recently if we're heading toward recession. And he said, well, yes, but this is actually a good thing. It's been raining money on fools for far too long. Some bankruptcies need to happen. And so this is one of the issues that suppliers are really have been struggling with here ever since, this incredible surge in this movement toward electrification, because they need to know which manufacturers are going to survive. And if you went back 3 months ago, 4 months ago, 6 months ago, you'd say, well, they're all going to survive. Are you kidding me? Look at this market. This is incredible. And now all of a sudden, the access to capital is coming under tremendous pressure. And so the suppliers, the very same suppliers that have now pursued these new opportunities, in many cases, they may not come to fruition. And so all of a sudden they have to go back to their traditional ICE offerings that have been profitable to continue to fund some of these, that will fall away. All right, so quickly, if we look at current opportunities, based on current business environment, what do you believe are your biggest opportunities at this moment? Number one, business conquest and consolidation. So our supplier members believe that there's tremendous opportunity, for those that are being run well, those that have been very careful in terms of due diligence. They feel very confident about this opportunity. Volume growth, we know that's come under pressure, but there's still significant volume growth here of 1 million units of additional volume for this year. Cost recovery, big focus for suppliers to go back to their OEM customers and to go to their customers and say, listen, we need some cost relief. And here's a very clear case as to why. The battery electric vehicle segment represents significant opportunity, many, many new nameplates. What's really crucial here is simply aligning your capability, your competency as a supplier with the opportunities that are there and with the risk profile that's appropriate for your organization. So quick one here, just to end things. We know the economy clearly is volatile right now. It's fragile. Shocks hurt the economy, reduce demand, and volatility and inflation remain. It's crucial to deploy scenario planning right now for all players. And so to look at some worst case scenarios, what if, right? So that suppliers can be prepared. Rising risks, clearly a recession, no question. Attack cost recovery, absolutely crucial. CapEx, it's interesting, crisis, sometimes when your back is against the wall, it forces and actually it does accelerate risks, but it does sometimes actually open a door. It actually reduces resistance to change. And so I think in some cases, there's opportunities for organizations to be even bolder. Flexibility, absolutely crucial. Liquidity is the key now. Now cash is king once again, right? And so it's crucial though to balance core technologies, core capabilities, core profitability versus these emerging targets. And so with that, I really appreciate the opportunity. I'll hand it back. Okay. Thank you. Look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. You want to talk a little bit?
Yes, while we're trying to get switched over to a Zoom feed. So Flavio is the cleanup hitter.
You ready to go, Flavio?
All right. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, everyone, for indulging me in a virtual session. Would have absolutely loved to have been there, spent a lot of time in the area, and would have loved to meet new faces and speak to new people. One of the things that we know is true around here is to never follow Mike and Daniel in presentations. I think they did a very, very good job in explaining some of the supplier dynamics that are not just native to Japan and the US market, which are, of course, the two biggest partnerships for the Canadian automotive supplier sector. But also it's how we operate here in Canada. It has been a tough couple of years, but especially the last year in terms of the dynamics on input costs, labor availability, access to markets. But I'm going to give you a bit of an overview on what the Canada carve-out is in this North American automotive perspective. Who are we? We are the industry association for Canadian parts manufacturers, about 200 companies that organized about 70 years ago to do a series of things. First of all, we represent about 100,000 direct employees in Canada in part supply, in systems supply, hard and soft systems, as well as tools. 95% of the independent parts supply is represented in the APMA, and we spent a lot of time in Washington and in Mexico City and all the subnational auto capitals around North America. And we try to demonstrate through unique projects ready Canadian commercial technology. A bit of context for you all about Canada within the North American context. There's 37 assembly plants within a 500-kilometer radius of the Windsor-Detroit border, going up to just past the Toronto area, and then down around, sweeping through Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, New York, and they make about 8 million vehicles annually in a regular year, a non-COVID slowdown year. And Canada, of course, has got 5 OEMs: Stellantis, Ford, General Motors, Toyota, Honda, manufacturing vehicles in Ontario, and also lots of R&D facilities. Those 5 OEMs, in spite of a tough time over the last couple of years, have all rebet on their future in Canada, $16 billion invested in the last couple of years. This is the important contextual slide. Mike and I spent a lot of time together, the OESA, and MEMA and the APMA work very closely together on trade issues, and we spent a better part of 2 years being the industry's eyes and ears and voice in the renegotiated new USMCA. Important in that new agreement is that we went from compliance for tariff-free sale being based on 29 parts component classes and 62.5% of a vehicle to about 60 component classes and 75% levels. We think that means that the new rules are expected to create about 25% increase in absolute shipments from the current manufacturing base. It's important for Canada because we don't have any Canadian OEMs. And so our industry is the 5 OEMs that are here manufacturing and the 1,400 supplier factories that are here. Canadian cars are American cars. You know, there's 50% US parts and 60% US raw materials. And I call that American. It's all the transnational companies that are based in the US, German, French, Japanese, Korean, American, Mexican, Canadian that ship into Canada to make cars. And we make 2 million a year here. And we also buy 2 million a year, but they're not the same cars. 80% of the cars that we make are shipped to that US market, which is right next door. The parts that we make in our factories, $35 billion in a non-COVID year, 48% of those parts are exported to production in US factories, the rest in Canadian factories. Studies by the Center for Automotive Research in Michigan, as well as the EDC in Canada, show that any number of individual parts could cross the border 7 to 8 times before they end up in an assembled vehicle to a customer. The integration between Canada and US and then also to a large part Mexico is incredible. Canadian investments, parts suppliers like Magna, Linamar, Martinrea, Woodbridge, ABC, global 100 suppliers are invested throughout North America. And in fact, in Mexico, there are 120 Canadian factories that employ 44,000 Mexican workers. And in the US, 156 factories that employ 43,000 Americans. The Canadian supply reality is a North American supply reality. In the US Southeast and in Mexico, the biggest issues for suppliers over the last couple of years, beyond the input costs and the OEM shortages in semiconductors, is labor reliability. It's labor turnover. It's the seniority of labor. We fared better in our Canadian factories, but our Canadian factories were affected by semiconductor shortages in the last year more than our American factories. 25% reduction in volume manufacture in Canada in the last year, about 15 to 20 in our American and Mexican operations. Mike gave a great overview, but I just wanted to point out what Canada is in terms of the pull side of the North American market. In a non-COVID year, the combined markets between the 3 countries, it's about 20 million units, about the same as Western Europe and probably the same level of disposable income, but certainly dwarfed by the domestic market in terms of volume of China, where we've all turned our eyes to. We took a major hit, went down to about 50% reduction in the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, and then we came back up. We have now seen a 25% reduction based on COVID and semiconductor shortages, but also very importantly, Mike talked a little bit about the cost of petrochemicals. There's also a 100-year storm in Texas last year that knocked out much of the resin production that Canadian and American plastic suppliers rely on. The spot price of steel is up 3 times from Valley price in 2021. it has been increasingly difficult with 5 or 6, once in a generation challenges showing up at the same time. The USMCA is, of course, the bedrock on which the Canadian automotive sector is based on. The USMCA comes on the back of 25 years of a NAFTA arrangement, which came on the back of a Canada-US deal that came on the back of the first trade agreement ever signed between Canada and the US, which was the Auto Pact, signed in 1965. That essentially at the core of them all guaranteed production in Canada in exchange for market access. We have FTAs with Japan in the TPP, Europe with the CETA, and Korea with the Canada-Korea deal, all of which were negotiated with other industries leading the negotiating dynamic than automotive. Access for agricultural implements, access for cultural goods and digital goods and services, and all of which were with regions that had their own OEMs. In our experience, my experience at the table with the Canada, Europe, the TPP, and the NAFTA renegotiations that created the USMCA is, of course, countries that have native OEMs have a lot more sway in rules of origin at the table in negotiations. We did well in the NAFTA renegotiation to the USMCA, but there were some lessons to learn. Canada does not have a native domestic OEM, so we're look for creative approaches in how to bring to market all of the advantages that that Canada represents. The second biggest IT cluster in North America and the fastest growing one is in Canada, north of that Windsor-Detroit bridge, and it is in the from Waterloo to Toronto. In terms of critical minerals required for battery electric vehicle production, the biggest North American volumes of lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite are in the ground in Canada. The challenges, of course, is none of the mining companies is a charity, and the anchor accounts haven't shown up yet. Big battery orders, big cell orders, and so who will pay for the extraction, who will pay for the processing, is a big discussion amongst the supply community here in Canada. The federal government in Canada came up with $4 billion to start in the last budget for extraction in a strategy they called From Mines to Mobility. What did we do as a trade association? Well, we did something rather unprecedented. We said, we think we have in Canada, from stem to stern, every single component of a vehicle manufactured by somebody here, including advanced connectivity and autonomous drive systems, and including artificial intelligence and machine learning. Toronto is the birthplace of artificial intelligence and still the global leader, although the world is catching up. And Montreal is a global leader in machine learning. Companies like Denso investing in Montreal and Quebec for the first time in its history. We decided that we were going to launch a project, an ambitious project that was going to be a 100% Canadian designed, engineered, supplied concept prototype to be able to use an original design, build it as a prototype that is adheres to the 2025 Canadian motor vehicle safety standards for the 2025 model year. And we launched this just before the pandemic started. Incredible response. 534 companies bid on the RFP. About 60 of them will be on the vehicle, but we've had direct engagement with the supply chain across the country on current OEM suppliers, as well as companies that are crossing their technology over in the connected and autonomous space. In total, we've been able to put together $25.5 million worth of commitment to build it and direct support from the Canadian and two major provincial governments. And you'll see a vehicle and not just a PowerPoint later on this year that will tour major auto shows as well as technology demonstrations. Why do we need to do that? First of all, it's crazy. And nobody else is in a position to strand $25 million of original investment. But we're here to promote the Canadian technology, but also speaks to the creativity required for a smaller global automotive force to be able to get into those discussions in creative ways for supply in a very tight supply market. But also Toyota helps to tell Japan's story around the world. General Motors, Ford helps to tell the American story. Who tells the Canadian story? Well, the Canadian story is a supplier story, and it's a cost that most of us impute into our operations. We don't get the winds at our back. We need to go out there and explain, and we think this Aero will do yeoman's work for a lot of our suppliers. We're currently in conversations, very serious conversations with three major OEMs on the application of a new technology that will originate on this platform into their vehicles. And we're hoping that part of this, it will also help sell Canada around the world as the place in one of the key places in North America, if not the key place in North America, to commit to electric vehicle manufacturing. We're not alone. A lot of OEs have looked at Canada and said, look, if this is the place where I could source my lithium oxide, my nickel at quantities that are required on the time frame that requires it, if we're going to assemble 900-pound batteries, do cathodes and anodes and cells, battery thermal systems, and electronic controls, and that's probably a really good place to make our electric cars as well. Well, since the signing of the USMCA right before the pandemic started, and since all the various commitments from the major markets around the world, jurisdictions to go to some type of zero emission vehicle mandate, 50%, 100% by the 2030s. In Canada, the target is 100% by 2035. In the US, 50% by 2030. All the major automakers in Canada that were already invested in Canada making vehicles have recommitted for new tooling in partnership with the government and in partnership with the supply sector to invest in an unprecedented term, $16 billion over the last 20 months or so. Canada is growing as a place to make zero emission vehicles of the future, and Canadian supply sector has been challenged to address that. On one hand, of course, we have the critical minerals, and we think we're going to be major battery players here. We are the biggest intersection. If you map out North America with IT clusters, and then you overlay automotive clusters, and then you overlay mining clusters, the only place all three intersect is in Ontario and Quebec in Canada, right about here. But 30% of that $35 billion that we manufacture every year is in parts, whole or in part, internal combustion engine specific components, engine components, transmission components, intake and exhaust. So the real big challenge for Canada is as the market and regulators are shifting to zero emission vehicles, as OEs are investing heavily in the manufacture of electric vehicles, Those electric vehicles are scheduled to come online in 2004, 2005, and 2006 in these commitments. Volumes will be lower, and it means that major engine manufacturers and transmission manufacturers like Linamar, Canada's second biggest supplier, must invest in new castings, in motors, in e-gears, and in alternative propulsion of the future, like hydrogen cells and electric. And what you're seeing is companies like that making a very serious commitment both to the technology development and to the manufacture of those. That will be the biggest challenge for Canada beyond the challenges that Mike and Daniel have demonstrated that are specific to this moment in time. We are going all in on battery electric vehicles, but we need to make sure that the companies that have built this industry survive that transition. Thank you.
Well, so we've had three different perspectives, and we'll open up now to questions and answers. I did flag one topic that I thought sitting here close to Detroit on Thursday, I don't think we'll be able to see the Ambassador Bridge. But when we talk about this Canadian-US trade, and Japan has some parallel issues, there are really two border crossings that are central. A bridge across between the US and Canada and Sarnia, and then the Ambassador Bridge between Windsor and Detroit. There's also a tunnel.
Keep talking.
There's also a tunnel, but the tunnel is really passenger traffic. So one, not having crossed in several years, I took and made the mistake of trying to use the Ambassador Bridge because it was convenient from where I was coming from, and very quickly learned that even if it's a bit out of the way, taking the tunnel is a whole bunch different. So something with this integration is the ability to get across borders. And COVID certainly has had an impact. And then there's the longstanding issue after bridge, privately owned and hence a monopoly, and has been a sore point. So while we have people from both the US and Canadian side, I thought I would bring up the challenge of integration with the physical challenge of getting parts back and forth across the border, as noted sometimes multiple times, as value is added at different stages of moving towards a complete component and then a complete vehicle. Maybe Flavio, since you're at your mic, if you could start off on that.
Sure. I'll just be really quick. The Ambassador Bridge is the single most important infrastructure, a piece of infrastructure in Canada, US, and probably the single most important bridge in all of the auto sector in North America. About $100 million worth of parts cross over in either direction every day, and a similar number, of course, in finished vehicles. Our issues across border for the first year and a half of the pandemic, of course, were the very tight restrictions, quarantine requirements for travelers back and forth. The federal governments on both sides did a very good job of giving special provision for trucks that traveled over with goods, and a different set of rules for truck drivers for isolation and quarantining. They didn't do a great job in terms of allowing for specialists. Some of these companies, some of the companies I represent that have very serious operations in all three countries, couldn't get their specialists to qualify as essential travel to go into the different countries over the last 3 years, and that was a real big bone of contention. But very, very importantly, the last 6 months or so, the issue has been both countries came up with new rules for truckers and said that they needed to be vaccinated if they were going to travel. Otherwise, they'd have to be quarantined. 95% of the industry was vaccinated. The rest were redeployed for deliveries inside the countries, within their countries. In early February, though, following a lot of, I think for our French audience, a yellow vester type protests, freedom convoys in Canada that took siege of the parliamentary precinct in Ottawa. About 30 of them decided that they were going to park their pickup trucks at the end of the bridge and claim to be truckers, and blocked international travel at that bridge for 4 days. It caused a lot of debate in this country. Very clear rules, provincial, municipal, and federal, in that defined that as a legal activity, but law enforcement was very reluctant to intervene. Ground the industry to a halt for the second and third and fourth day because, of course, of all our just-in-time principles. We, as an industry association, me as the lead plaintiff, took the protests to federal court to seek an injunction requiring law enforcement to go and clear that bridge. We were able to do that on the third day and get the bridge cleared on the fourth day. And the story of clearing that bridge in this country was the intervention of the industry, led by the suppliers on the Canadian side, to get a court to force the municipal and provincial law enforcement authorities to do their job. We are, of course, concerned about the long-term effect, and a lot of, especially Michigan-based congressional representatives talked a lot in those days about, well, are we too exposed to Canadian supply? Maybe our policies and our federal money should go into tightening our American based supply. But that is a very, very key and hot issue for Canadian suppliers today. And I say with humility, I'm very, very proud to have been able to be the person and the organization that broke that logjam, that international crisis.
Okay, well, questions from people here in the audience.
I would like first to thank all the three speakers, because they were very good presentation, full of interesting data and concepts. So I have a question for Daniel. I think I like very much your emphasis on the fact that a just-in-time organization is fragile, so you need to build a robust organization surrounding that. And that is the core of the Toyota production system. And you insisted very much into that. But I remember reading a Mary Sacco paper on the way Toyota manages suppliers. And I remember that there was lack, but there was also some redundancy, something that you wouldn't find often written about the way Toyota managed the supplier base. And for example, the principle of double ordering, having all the time at least two suppliers capable of supplying a part, or the fact that Toyota has assembler that can step in and produce the cars sometimes when Toyota has problem with some factories. And I thought that is a concept that is not always available. So I wanted to ask you about slack, but also redundancy in managing the supply chain. And then I had the question for Mike Jackson and for Mr. Volpe is about, you spoke about the supplier industry as a whole. But now in Europe, we are start to be more and more concerned on the fact that the impact of all these crises and also the impact of electrification will be very different depending on how big you are, where you are in the value chain, what type of products you make. And the general feeling is that OEMs will go through that, in particular those who can produce this high value, high price model that will do that very well. The generalist car makers will be more difficult because they are at that price, they're not very competitive, but they would find a way to reintegrate productions, invest in battery assembling and so on. Global suppliers, they will find a way to catch the opportunities that are there because they have investment capabilities. They can also produce for those car makers that make these very high value added cars. But then the second and third tier suppliers, in particular, those very much specialize in internal combustion engine technologies. And for example, in France, it's 50% of the supplier basis that is there and 50% of the employment that is there. They are not ready, they are not informed, and is going very fast in Europe. As you know, that the CLEPA, your similar association, has lost the battle for a neutral technology, that they didn't want this 2035 ban on internal combustion engine, but the European Parliament voted for that. So that is now is going to be law, not a mandate, not a commitment. And that means that it's going to happen very, very fast. So what about these differences between suppliers, and what do you think is the right speed that will allow these more suppliers to survive?
Tommaso, thank you. I think you're absolutely right. So the redundancy in there is very important. So the 2 or 3 suppliers is a way to get also the competition side, right? So you can have them, you can reward the one that's doing better. So I think there's a way to, have it in there, not just for like a continuity side, but also the competitiveness side. I think it also is important not to be reliant on just one. But there are cases when there is, they are reliant on just one, really a sole supplier. So I think in that case, really fortification and being quick to recover becomes especially critical in that case. But I think you're absolutely right. Building in that redundancy and is a key point. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, a great question. And one other point just to follow on there, obviously we know that, relative to the pandemic, Toyota was actually far ahead of the industry as a whole. Toyota was the one that in the aftermath of the earthquake and tsunami, that it recognized that semiconductor was absolutely one of the most critical elements that they needed to manage relative to supply chain and relative to safety stocks. And so what's absolutely crucial there is that, for the first 9 months while the industry was reeling, effectively Toyota was far better insulated because of just a tremendous focus on this area. That said, one of the other questions that you had asked was just outstanding, just in terms of how exactly do suppliers navigate this current environment with this accelerated push toward electrification. And I think it's interesting because we know certainly there is electrification, pure battery electric vehicles are going to be an absolutely crucial part. I think it's interesting if you look at a number of Japanese manufacturers, the Toyota, Honda, they were very slow in terms of evaluating, because they recognized, well, wait a minute, they were very deliberate, right? I would say, and the point there is simply is recognizing that subsidies are absolutely crucial in terms of to catalyze and to accelerate adoption of the technology to scale it. For suppliers, though, it's really it's crucial because there's this parallel path, right? You need to fund with these new investments. And even as much as we look at Tesla historically and say, well, wow, look at Tesla now, it's been this incredible success story, right? But I think if we look at Rivian today, it's a very clear reminder that Tesla was much like Rivian today, in that it wasn't a linear progression. It wasn't a very steady, stable growth trajectory. It was incredible with incredibly volatile, right? With fits and starts. And so I think what's important to remember is that there has to be this parallel path. I think it's very interesting that BMW CEO Oliver Zipse, he recently said, listen, electrification is important and it's going to change the industry as we know it, but not every use case lends itself to electrification. And so what he was simply saying is that, yes, of course, it's going to be a very fundamental driver here going forward. But what's really critical now, especially given headwinds of recession, is that having this balance between ICE, internal combustion engine vehicles and electrification, is it has the ability, you have the ability to pivot, you have the ability to balance and navigate relative to timing. And so if adoption rates as a result of higher purchase price for electric vehicles is required, if that is delayed, then all of a sudden then suppliers need to make sure they delay and they produce accordingly for those vehicles that are in demand and profitable today. And so it's an important one. What I like to say is that it's much like an investment portfolio, right? It's very crucial to have a strong presence in a range of technologies in order to then, align with opportunities that come and then to align your risk portfolio, your risk tolerance with the opportunities that come. And so to be able to have that parallel path, it's crucial to gain that experience, even with some smaller programs, become more capable, develop the competency so that you're in a stronger position here going forward. And one of the big concerns that we have certainly is that, many of our members, our most recent survey asked, have you seen higher supplier distress across your lower tier suppliers? And so absolutely. And so it's about 2/3 indicate, yeah, there's greater, at least a slight increase in terms of greater supplier distress. And that's on top of last year. Last year, where it was nearly 3/4 of suppliers indicated, yeah, there's a tremendous amount of supplier distress. And so that financial distress is important to navigate here going forward. But, to your point, electrification is going to be crucial to develop that competency, to scale it, and to become more capable here going forward.
Okay, I think we have time for perhaps one more question.
Thanks for giving me this last minute. My name is Marieke Stevens. I'm at the Erasmus University in the Netherlands. My question was for Mike. You discussed recovery of the automotive. You discussed recovery of the automotive industry in terms of volume growth. Do you think there's another way where consumers pay more for access to mobility and we don't need to grow?
So great question. I mean, I think in terms of increased mobility and in terms of new business models and the idea of charging per miles driven, things like this, there are certainly opportunities, but I guess my points were really kind of aiming toward the near term, relative to suppliers, and they're kind of the 2 to 4 year window right now is that there's an expectation, clearly that we'll get through this, and that volume growth will recover, in terms of both demand and production. I think, there's no question that electrification ushers in a new capabilities. And so as a result, connectivity and, advanced safety, advanced technologies, new business models. And so those business models are actually going to be the key driver of profitability in the future. And so this is what's so important when we look at the industry as a whole. Today, the profitability comes from producing a component or a system. And yet in the future, there's going to be the monetization is going to come from making data and making information available. And so that's going to actually contribute to a disproportionate share of margin potential here in the future. So a great question to close on, I think.
Okay, do we have to move on, or do we have a few more minutes? Bruce, you're the final arbiter there. We have a minute. So, looking forward, the bottleneck right now is the semiconductor industry. I had a chance to chat last week with a couple of the different major players in the automotive footprint. One of the challenges is that even if the overall supply demand changes, computer sales falling, white goods sales falling, that automotive semiconductors require unique packaging. So it's not generic. A cell phone does not take the abuse that a chip embedded in a car takes. So there are a lot of issues going forward, and it's fun to delve into the nitty gritty of specific components, but the overall issues of the supply chain, absolutely central to the industry, the source of new technologies, but facing these strategic business challenges over the next decade. And so, we will have many opportunities to return to the topic. We have the USMCA panel later today, and then we have a panel looking at labor in the US, Canada, and Mexico later in the week. So other chances to look at different aspects of this set of issues. So I thank everyone for listening in, participating, and I thank our speakers.